Okay, so I'm going to begin with just a couple of minutes of audio excerpts.
अव्वल सना इलाही अव्वल सना इलाही जो मालिक हर दा उसदा नाम चितारण वाला हर मैदान नहरदा
Okay, I will just pause here, check if there's anyone waiting in the lobby, like the good concierge that I am. No, that looks fine. Okay, good. In that case, I will continue. The sounds that you just heard were recorded some 4,000 miles apart. The first was made in Kashmir, Pakistan in 2014, while the second was made in Rochdale in the north of England later that same year. In both recordings, the words being sung are from a collection of poetry called the Saif ul-Malook, written in the mid-19th century by the Sufi mystic and poet Mian Muhammad Bakhsh. Mian Muhammad Bakhsh lived in the Mirpur area of southern Kashmir, an area from which a large majority of British Pakistanis trace their heritage and where they may continue to maintain strong ties today. In this paper, I explore the performance and patronage of this poetry in both Pakistan and Britain. And I consider how the story of the Saif ul-Malook and its performance relates to Kashmiris' lived past experiences of migration and how this is passed down generations born within Britain through what Maurice Halbwachs terms collective memory. By lived past experiences, I'm referring here to the work of early anthropologists of memory, Barry Schwartz and Eviata Zerubavel, who argued that performative acts constitute memory repositories in which understandings of the past are socially constructed and enacted. Following Jan Assmann and John Katzblicker, I want to show how performances of sung poetry, and the Saif ul-Malook in particular, communicate the first-hand lived memory of migration to future generations, many of whom will have been born within a destination country, and yet are still confusingly perceived and portrayed as migrants in scholarly, political, and media discourse. Understanding migration through this idea of collective memory, I want to suggest, cuts across some of the more established writing on migration that has tended to treat ethnicity and religion as a first port of call, often at the expense of cultural practices such as music and poetry. Drawing on fieldwork conducted between 2009 and 2018 among musicians at Mian Muhammad Bakhsh shrine in Khari Sharif, Azad Kashmir, and in various performance contexts in the north of England, places like Rochdale and Bradford, I connect the relationship between memory and migration to the story of the Saif ul-Malook in order to rethink how the circulation of people, money, and culture between Britain and Pakistan continues to shape the way migration is imagined and valued today. So I'm going to begin with an anecdote from my fieldwork in Kashmir. I'd woken up in this house here under a kind of heavy Kashmiri sky at the home of my Shehnai teacher, Abdul Ali Khan. A Shehnai is a kind of wooden oboe. Abdul's house that you can see here offered a good vantage point over the rest of the village. We had a busy day ahead, a 3-hour drive around the vast Mangla Dam up into the mountains to perform at a wedding. I was in this village of Khari Sharif, which is also the local resting place of the Sufi saint Mian Muhammad Bakhsh, and also, of course, the home of my mentor, Ustad Abdul Ali Khan. Abdul's house was in many respects typical of those found in this area of Kashmir, arranged on one floor with 2 or 3 small rooms around a small central courtyard. Inside the rooms, they are furnished with several rope beds used for a mixture of sitting, entertaining, and sleeping, occasionally all at the same time. On the lilac and purple walls, rows of shelves display the family's best crockery, sometimes plastic, sometimes china, decorated with colourful floral patterns, and stacks of blankets, quilts and shawls preserved in clear plastic bags lie in wait for winter. I wanted to just show you this because over the coming months and years, we'd spend much of our time in these rooms and in this small courtyard outside, as friends and family would drift in and out to drink tea and generally shoot the breeze. That this was a kind of centre of a lot of family activity and musical activity. Outside, oh, I've got someone coming in. Outside, Abdul's wife Nasreen was preparing a breakfast of paya over an open fire. Paya is a watery stew of goat trotters cooked overnight with spices, onion, and garlic. I'm salivating as I'm describing this. And we ate it with this pile of freshly baked tandoori naan lathered with melted ghee. I tore off a piece of the naan and dipped it in the broth. Today, Abdul explains, we're going to be playing at the function of a UK family, that this was shadi season, wedding season, which is the best season. All UK families come here to get married, and every day we are busy. At this point, Abdul retrieved one of the bones from the broth and, looking at me with a raised eyebrow, sucked out the marrow. But first, I want to show you something. We set off north into the mountains on his 125cc Honda motorbike, hugging the side of the Mangla Dam, which you can see here on our left. The monsoon rains hadn't yet fully arrived, and the water, as you can see, was very low. The dam's beds temporarily reclaimed and turned into lush pastures of wheat. Reaching the north side, we began to wind our way up higher and deeper into Kashmir. The air cooled as we rose, and the land grew greener, thickening with vegetation. After a couple of hours, we reached the summit of the mountain and dismounted. The view was spectacular and vast. Our mountain dropped away sharply to an expansive green valley floor, peppered here and there with houses. And we could hear the chatter and clanging of people on the valley floor half a mile below, as though it was one massive amphitheatre. On the other side of the valley, the mountains rose again dramatically, reaching a distant crescendo with the snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas, which you can see here in the distance. Abdul looked east towards these mountains and pointed out that over there was India. Before Pakistan was born, Abdul explained, my family would perform all over Kashmir, now just on this side. Many locals have family, he told me, just a few miles away across the border, and they haven't seen each other physically since the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. From where we stood, however, such a partition was hard to discern. The land appeared to continue uninterrupted, borderless, except for where it met the sky. Abdul reached into his pocket at that point and withdrew a silver coin. He looked at it briefly before handing it over. This is a silver 1 rupee coin minted in 1862 at the height of British colonial rule. I turned the coin over in my hand, rubbing my thumb across the contours of Queen Victoria's head. This is for you, Abdul said. I looked down at the coin and nodded, unsure what to say. This was surely worth quite a lot of money, but I also understood that it carried a kind of heavier weight. It was emblematic in some ways of a shared past hovering in the present, of Britain and Pakistan, two sides of an unearthed coin. Thank you, I said, turning my head to him. Koi baat nahi, he replied, waving me away, don't mention it. His dog had apparently dug up a small hoard of these coins in a nearby graveyard. Lots of symbolism there, which I think is quite good. And once he'd learned of my visit, he decided to give one to me. He said, this is part of your history. You're British, and you can take it home with you. So at some point, this coin with Queen Victoria's head on it had been buried along with the British Empire. In its place stood the newly independent countries of India and Pakistan, countries at their inception marked by the movement of people. And the coin serves as a reminder of a past that shaped this land politically and economically. Its history as an object tells us something of the relationship between migration and music in this part of the world. The coin was minted during a time when this area of Kashmir was fertile ground for Sufi poetic traditions. Mian Muhammad Bakhsh, the poet with whom I began this paper, was born around 1830 in the village of Khari Sharif, some 20 kilometers south of Old Mirpur, which, as I say, is a region from which many British Pakistanis trace their heritage. And it's where they continue to maintain strong cultural and familial ties today. It was in this area of Kashmir that Mian Muhammad Bakhsh wrote his acclaimed book of poetry, Safar ul-Ishq, Journey of Love, but more commonly known as the Saif ul-Malook. Often described to me by Kashmiris as the Rumi of Kashmir, Mian Muhammad Bakhsh was 33 years old when his collection was written, coinciding almost precisely with when the 1 rupee coin was minted. The collection, which includes some 9,249 rhyming couplets, is written in a local Punjabi dialect of Patwari, but with a rich vocabulary of Persian and Arabic. There are no definitive versions. Instead, much of the poetry is passed down orally through performances, published as excerpts or else handwritten in notebooks. The Saif ul-Ishq tells the story of a handsome Egyptian prince, Saif ul-Malook, who was born into riches and wanted for nothing. The prince grows increasingly restless and one night falls into a vivid dream in which he sees a lake and a beautiful fairy. Upon awakening, Saif realizes that he has fallen completely in love with the fairy, known in the story as Badi'ul Jamala, and tells his father that he must leave home at once in a bid to find her. The fable then tells of his journey away from home in search of the fairy and the lake, despite his father's discouragement. As the story unfolds, the narrator, Mian Muhammad Bakhsh, becomes the protagonist's interlocutor and spiritual guide, warning Saif of the perils ahead and questioning the wisdom of leaving one's home. As he embarks upon his journey of love, the obstacles that Saif encounters become morality tales through which Mian Muhammad Bakhsh interpolates both the protagonist and the reader. Stories such as these are popular parables of spiritual and worldly movement. With its themes of remaining true to one's home, of the oppressed being saved from the oppressor, and of the need to be patient, to keep hope and faith in Allah, the story of the Saif ul-Malook is highly valued by Kashmiris in Pakistan and Britain. Its verses are performed and sung regularly throughout the year by hereditary musicians at weddings and festivals, but also by people everywhere, from taxis to barbershops to people's homes. It is, in many respects, the story of movement and displacement, not only in terms of its narrative arc, but through the way it has accompanied Kashmiris on their own migratory journeys. Arriving at a wedding in Kashmir on the day that Abdul gave me the coin, we met up with some other musicians in his ensemble. There was another Shanai player, 3 dhol players, a chimta player, and 2 singers. We had a bit of time to kill, and so entered a small shrine, a darbar, to cool off from the midday sun. As we sat down around the central tombstone, one of the singers in Abdul's troupe, Mr. Javid, began to sing.
अव्वल हमद सना इलाही अव्वल हमद सना इलाही जो मालिक हर यार दा उस दा नाम चितारन वाला हर मैदान नहरदा काम तमाम मयसर होंदे काम तमाम मयसर होंदे नाम उदा चित धरिया रहमू सुके सावे करदा कैरूं सारे हरिया कुदरत थी जिस बाग बनाए जग संसार तमामी रंग बरंगी बूटे लाए कुछ खास कुछ आमी एक ना दे फल मिठे कीते पाती उना दे कोड़े एक ना दे फुलकारी आवन नफे फलों दे तोड़े ऐसे अजायब बागे अंदर आदम दा रुख लाया मारिफत दा मेवा दे के वाह फलदार बनाया रहमत दा जदों पानी लगा तां होया ए हरिया अरे अरे डाली ने फल पाया सिर तरती जद तरया.
I'll pause it there. There is more, and if anyone wants to hear it, I'm very happy to share it with them. The words that you just heard are from the Saif ul-Malook. Mr. Javid was singing them unaccompanied. The rest of us gathered around him, drinking sugary pink Kashmiri tea. The melody bounced off the stone walls of the shrine, holding us within, while the words he sang transported us without. Awal Hamid, Shana Allahi, Jo Malik Hari Hari Da, Ustada Naam, Chitarin Wala, Usmedan Na Hari Da. The first praise be to Allah, the owner of everything. Whoever remembers his name will never be lost in the field. These opening lines introduce the Saif ul-Malook's story of love and loss, a story that forms the basis of so many of Mian Muhammad Bakhsh's poetic couplets, and which also spoke to the topography around us. The melody Mr. Javid sings in this recording follows Rag Pahari, a North Indian musical mode often associated with light classical music. The name of the rag was no coincidence. Pahar means mountain. This was music for a grand scale. Sat as we were with the mountains of Kashmir as our backdrop, the mountain rag, Rag Pahari, resonated with our surroundings, those sat among us, and, as I would later learn, Kashmiris far away in Bradford. Why might this be the case? Well, Hindustani classical music is a highly sophisticated and virtuosic form of chamber and solo music, the melodies of which are based on the raga system, or melodic modes. As scholars of Hindustani classical music have noted, a raga is a complex intermedial entity that takes both a sonic form as a musical mode and an iconic form as an image, whether visualized in performance or as a painting. The sonic form of the raga is meant to evoke the iconic form and its emotional associations in the listener. In other words, what you hear is also supposed to relate to what you see, both in terms of the external world and one's internal experience and spiritual experience of it. Given what we know about how a raga's sonic and iconic form are intertwined, we can begin to understand how the melody we just heard, as it travelled up and down the scale, provides a contour to Mian Muhammad Bakhsh couplets, a contour that in many ways echoed the surrounding peaks. It also gives a hint as to why this sung poetry is important in migratory contexts. Kashmiris at home and abroad don't just hear this poetry, they also see this landscape. Many months later, as I sat in Mr. Kokar's Kashmiri barbershop in Bradford, England, I heard these verses again, sung to this mountain rag. It was early evening, the customers had left, and the barbershop became a temporary mehfil, a space of music and poetry. Once again, I was sat with half a dozen men. Instruments appeared, such as what you can see here, a sitar, but there was also a dholak and, of course, the voice. Rag Pahari again filled my ears, and I was transported back to the shrine in Kashmir. Opening my eyes, it began to make sense to me why the walls of this barbershop in Bradford were inscribed with quotations from the Saif ul-Malook. Outside the window was Bradford, but in between the buzzing of hair clippers and the chatter of customers was the memory of a time before, a land elsewhere, easily at hand, there on the wall, just a glance away. I asked Mr. Kokar about when he first arrived in Bradford. He said, it was very different then, not like today. Work was very hard, and I missed my family back home. Upon arrival, Mr. Kokar joined his father, who had already moved to Bradford some years earlier, and Mr. Kokar arrived in 1971 at the age of 14. He had lived much of his life in Takipur, 10 kilometres away from what was then the new city of Mirpur. Takipur is near where this photograph was taken. Despite its proximity to the city, Takipur was and remains a rural area, often consisting of just one-story houses, and his childhood was spent playing with his cousins in the fields nearby on the banks of the Jhelum River, which you can see here. They kept poultry and goats and fighting dogs. Bradford, compared to this pastoral scene, was a shock. The city was still heavily industrialized, though the industry was already by that point in a terminal decline, undercut by cheaper manufacturing in East Asia and South America, early globalization giving way to new. At 14, Mr. Kokar was still required to go to school, but the main motivation behind his arrival in Bradford was to contribute to the money that his father was sending back to the family in Takipur. I told my dad, I don't like it here, I want to go back home. And my dad, he said, okay, well, let's see, after a few months, if you still don't like it, I'll buy you a ticket. Mr. Kokar didn't remember much about his school days. He couldn't speak English very well, and the school system in Bradford at that stage was ill-equipped to deal with such an ethnically and religiously diverse student body. The ramifications of this were felt in what became known as the multiculturalism debate. But then again, he wasn't in school for very long. After 3 months, he turned 15, left school and went to work in Buttershaw Mill, which you can see on screen now. Mr. Kokar said, I learned what I had to at the mill. I didn't really have much of another other education in the UK. But what he did know about, however, was poetry and music. Growing up in Takipur, Mr. Kokar was surrounded by music and poetry. The elders in his village would regularly sit around the courtyard together, reciting passages from the Saif ul-Malook and other Sufis. Whenever you had a problem, he said, or if you were naughty, you would get a slap, but you would also hear a lesson. Whenever something happened, there was always a verse to explain what you should do and what you should learn. At a time when many people from his village were emigrating to Britain, the poetry of Mian Muhammad Bakhsh was always at hand to offer wisdom and advice. In this couplet, Mian Muhammad Bakhsh says that it is better to eat even the bitter fruits of your own land gardens than to go to foreign gardens and eat sweet fruits. The Saif ul-Malook is full of cautionary tales such as these, stories about roaming far away from home and the perils one faces. But they are also read by Kashmiris as advice for how to live in lands far away from family, friends, and loved ones. With little or no formal schooling in either Mirpur or Bradford, these encounters with Sufi poetic traditions constituted, for Mr. Coker and many others of his generation, a formative learning experience. The ethical and moral tales imparted by these traditions are not only enacted through musical performances today, but are imbibed through everyday life, evident in family relations and in how Mirpuris orientate themselves in Britain. In the multiculturalism debate of the 1980s and 1990s, Kashmiris from Mirpur were often accused of living segregated lives, of not integrating properly into British society. Yet, if we understand migration less through the prism of ethnicity and religion, and more through musical and poetic practices, a more nuanced and complex picture of multiculturalism emerges. Early migrants to Bradford were quick to open food stores that stocked spices from home, restaurants to prepare familiar foods, and fabric stores to stitch traditional clothing. In Bradford, many of these stores carried and continue to carry signage in both Urdu and English. In this photograph, taken by Tim Smith, a Bradford-based photographer and local historian, two men can be seen affixing a sign above their shop. The Urdu calligraphy that you can see here is a transliteration rather than a translation of the Urdu words to its right. So it literally says Kashmiri tailors, ready-made garments. And this is something, though, that only those who could read Urdu would know. But it was visualizations of a foreign culture such as this that drove much of the backlash against multiculturalism in places like Bradford in the years that followed. Yet many of those early migrants spoke little and read little or no English. And so signs such as these show, on the contrary, a concerted effort to communicate across languages. Moreover, viewed through the moral teachings of the Saif ul-Malook, we come to understand some of the ethical and spiritual reasons Kashmiris chose to orientate themselves in this way. Mr. Kokar's memories of these early months and years in Bradford are a mixture of hardship and nostalgia. Working at the mill was hard. The hours were long and conditions were cramped, noisy, and dangerous. After work, Mr. Kokar would return home with his father. The men would stick together and take it in turns to cook curry. They had a common purpose, being here in Britain for the prosperity of their family back home. The mills may have been hard work, but the value of that work brought more than just economic benefits. By sending the majority of what they earned back to their village in Takipur, they projected an image of prosperity that elevated their family status back home. The money could buy material goods, but it also sent a message of movement, of both moving away and moving up in the world. Mr. Coker and his dad, in their room in Oak Lane, Bradford, looked after their family back home, providing them with food, clothes, and as the years wore on, new houses, cars, and marriages. They became great patrons of musicians back in Kashmir, musicians such as my own mentor, Abdul Ali Khan. Such patronage was itself a sign of prestige and status, conjuring images of the great Mughal courts of years gone by. For a community that values family relations and status so highly, patronizing performances of the Saif ul-Malook connected memories of the past to lived experiences of the present. Like so much Sufi poetry, the Saif ul-Malook presents both a moral and spiritual journey of unrequited longing for the beloved, full of ambiguities in which both the journey and the beloved can stand in for the worldly and the divine. The beloved can be Allah or the Prophet Muhammad, but also recited in migratory contexts can also mean home, wherever that may be. Such ambiguity resonates so strongly with Kashmiris because their sense of home hovers across both Pakistan and Britain, Mirpur and Bradford, having been established over the longue durée from the mid-19th century, as we saw with the 1 rupee coin, through to their history of post-war migration to places like Bradford that continues today. The musical performance and reception of the Saif ul-Malook in both Kashmir and Britain provides a window onto how Pakistanis understand their migratory experiences in ways that tie together various threads of politics, history, and geography. The sociologist of memory, Barry Schwartz, argued that collective memory should be understood semiotically in relation to their surrounding, more or less discrete cultural systems. Schwartz was drawing upon Clifford Geertz's definition of collective memory as a pattern of inherited conceptions expressed through symbolic forms, such as poetry, music, and other aspects of culture, through which people imagined, rehearsed, and articulated their knowledge of and responses to the lived environment. The key word here for the purpose of my analysis is inherited. For Geertz, these inherited conceptions, passed across and down generations, act as ways of understanding society and one's place within it. Collective memory, in this view, is a means of representing deeply rooted cultural values that may span generations as well as geographic distance, and so render present experiences meaningful. As a way of navigating multicultural societies, then, collective memory can be understood as providing a kind of map to navigate through culturally diverse spaces with their competing and overlapping world views. In performances of the Saif ul-Malook, with its themes of spiritual and worldly journeys, Kashmiri's collective memory of migration is enacted in narrative form, encapsulating key values of family, kinship, honor, within wider spiritual grand narratives of Sufism. These performances in taxis, barbershops, living rooms, town halls, are indexed against the story of Saif ul-Malook and its epic tale of worldly and spiritual movement, narrated by the iconic figure of Mian Muhammad Bakhsh. Such indexing allows past experiences of migration to act as what Goffman has described as a primary framework that allows those born within a destination country to make sense of their present. In this way, performances of the Saif ul-Malook not only connect separate realms of history, 19th century colonialism to 20th century multiculturalism, but subsequent generations to that history. Collective memory, in this way, provides anchorage and legitimacy to identities that sit otherwise uneasily across clunky national borders. Despite playing host to increasingly diverse societies, nation states are still often projected in politics and the media as more or less distinct cultural entities. Yet this has not been matched by scholarly attention towards migration's philosophical, political, and social histories. Multiculturalism as a policy and as a lived practice must, if it is to be effective, bridge this plurality of cultures on the one hand with the singularity of the nation state on the other. Given the likelihood that globalization and climate change in particular will produce ever-increasing levels of migration, the need for a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between diversity and nationalism is arguably more important now than ever before. The music and poetry of Mirpuris and Kashmiris at home and abroad thus present a useful and hitherto largely ignored window onto such histories and how they are understood and valued. The Saif ul-Malook is rich in narratives of home and belonging. It's historically rooted in its relationship with 19th century empire and nation state building. It's patronized today through the circulation of people and money between the diaspora and home. It has a history of interacting with state-led multicultural policies and is musically inflected with cross-cultural influences stretching back centuries. Given poetry's efficacy as a communicative language, it therefore speaks well to the lived realities of migration within and across national borders. And this focus on Kashmiri music making allows us to examine how this is happening, with a focus on the role of performance in shaping these ideas of belonging and home. By way of conclusion then, I want to just return to my opening anecdote. My mentor, Abdul, had brought me to the top of that mountain to witness a kind of juncture between land and history, to where many of the threads I've discussed today became intertwined. Looking across to Indian-controlled Kashmir that morning, I remember feeling not only a sense of arbitrariness and regret at this legacy of empire, but also a deeper feeling of permanence, not so much of the politics, but of the land, those vast mountains. And it was a reminder that while the politics of migration remains precarious, the land itself stretches beyond disputed borders in the hearts and minds of Kashmiris here and thousands of miles away. As the silver rupee and the empire it represented were laid to rest, the poetry of Mian Muhammad Bakhsh thrived above, traversing the land and giving anchorage to feelings of home and belonging. Mian Muhammad Bakhsh, his shrine in Khari Sharif, is today a site of pilgrimage for Kashmiris wherever they happen to be in the world. It's to here that Kashmiris return to for spiritual nourishment, to reflect, to receive blessings, marry, and ask for intercession. The poetry of Mian Muhammad Bakhsh, so full of lyrical metaphor for home and belonging, is central to Kashmiri's spiritual and cultural identity, especially as these identities become unmoored from the physical geography of this part of Pakistan through migration. While home can be Bradford, Rochdale, the Gulf states, or wherever Kashmiris migrate to and settle in today, a part of them still lives in this landscape, its memory kept alive through the performance and patronage of music and poetry. And so the political upheaval during the mid-19th century that gave rise to changing flows of money and power still reverberates in the act of migration to and from Kashmir today. The gift of this silver rupee seemed startlingly generous at the time. "This is part of your history and you can take it home with me," Abdul had said. Perhaps the coin was an invitation for me to look in the mirror and confront the past, or maybe simply a means of dissolving one kind of history and beginning another. The late David Graeber, reflecting on Marcel Mauss, suggested that such gifts are there to create alliances and obligations between individuals or groups who might not otherwise have anything to do with one another. A good point, perhaps, to reflect upon as we think about multiculturalism going forward. The coin would be travelling back to Britain with me, an awkward kind of reverse migration. Queen Victoria returning home from a country she famously never set foot in. I would be taking the coin, but I would also be taking a moment of intimacy shared on that Kashmiri mountainside. The exchange of the coin had created a bond between me and Abdul, and I wasn't sure what I would be reciprocating, but felt that whatever it was would unfold over time. If we look at it through the fable of the Saif ul-Malook, it was a reminder that beyond politics, people come into contact with one another across both time and space. They change and they exchange. I would be returning to Britain changed, and the value of the coin lay no longer in its currency, but in what it revealed about the past and a promise it held for the future. And that's the end of my paper. I will try and stop sharing if I can. Oh yeah, here we go. Yes, thanks.
That was a beautiful talk, Tom. Thank you so much. It was amazing. So we have 10 minutes. I think we can take 10 minutes for questions and comments. And I would like to prioritize our participants, our attendees' questions, if there are any, or if they wish to share any comments. Please feel free to post your questions via chat, or raise your hands, or just jump in the discussion with your voices. Are there any questions or quick comments?
I have one, Zaina. Piers.
Okay, please, Piers.
Apologies for not being visible, but the camera's in the other room. I'm sorry. I went to turn it on and realized that it didn't exist. Thank you so much. My question was, well, I don't know how important the kind of practice of this repertoire in the diaspora is for what you research, but it struck me when you were talking about Bradford that there's a kind of global narrative of the fragility of this stuff in new communities. I mean, it really doesn't matter which culture it is, and therefore I wondered whether your subject area in that respect, if it is your subject area, is kind of time limited, because I'm imagining that the gentleman in the barber's shop has teenage kids who are kind of watching whatever teenage kids watch, and are basically integrated in a different way, and probably regard his enormous kind of instrument as a kind of oddity, and that continuity seems to me you can't take for granted. So I wonder what the future is for that, or whether it'll just become a kind of the way memory becomes history too quickly.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there are a few points I can make to sort of try and address it. One is the kind of irony, which is that actually the place where these traditions, as far as I can tell, were most fragile, were not in Bradford, but in Kashmir. And so, for example, my mentor, Abdul, was a hereditary musician, came from a long line of Shehnai players, and his children were not going to become musicians.
Right, so you don't have to be in England to suffer that problem.
Yeah, so they were going to go to school, learn English, become engineers, become doctors or what have you. And in the UK, there is more of a kind of interest and engagement among younger Pakistanis who really do identify with their Kashmiri Mirpuri heritage. And one of the characteristics of this community is that family relations, known as biradari, the kind of kinship relations, which is perpetuated through marriages between places like Bradford and Mirpur, is still so central to how they organize their lives and how they orientate themselves. And at these, weddings, this music is a central part. So the patronage of the music is now, really coming also from younger generations of Pakistanis. And sort of historically, and sort of a slightly related point that I might make is that unlike other South Asian communities in Britain, Kashmiris have never been quite as involved with or dependent upon state-led projects that promoted multiculturalism, so multicultural festivals and what have you, and instead cultivated a music culture and scene that was very much within the community. And that's meant that they have been sort of less exposed to the vagaries of politics and the drying up of funding and what that might mean for how music and culture and poetry is sort of preserved, in one way or another. And so it does feel to me, from what I've seen in Bradford and in Kashmir, that it's, a tradition that is sort of not as fragile as it might be. Does
that mean in practice that, for example, youngsters would still commit the poetry to memory? Because that's something that, as you know, in sort of, I don't know, English culture, is kind of a big generational marker, but I don't think it happens in the same way as it did.
Yeah, and I think it is the case that that sort of familiarity with the poetry is very much there, and that's because the language is still very central to everyday life, and that this poetry is, of course, I didn't talk about this a huge amount in the paper, but that it's spiritual, right? So it's also part of people's religious life as well, and so there is a kind of everydayness about this poetry still being practiced, as I say, jotted down in notebooks or in barbershops, that is very important. And these concerts are happening all the time. They're just not advertised in ways that we might be aware of. So it's a much bigger tradition, I'd say, than is more widely known.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Any other questions from our audience?
Hi, I have a question. Hi, Thomas. Thank you very much for that. I joined a bit late, which I'm pretty sad about. I didn't get to see the start, but I'm Mirpuri Pakistani and I'm from Bradford as well. Oh. And Saif ul-Malook is something I've grown up with, so it's awesome to see that an event was happening. And I'm doing a master's in South Asian Area Studies right now, and I have so many questions, honestly. I think way too many questions, and I won't waste anyone's time. So can I get your email or something that I could
definitely
ask? Awesome. Can you but yeah, way too many questions to ask about your experience and everything, and I'd love to have a Zoom meeting if possible. Because I'd love to do my dissertation on something like this. So can you get your email or something?
Yeah, definitely. I'll post it in the chat, and it'd be fantastic to catch up on Zoom and share memories of Bradford. Obviously, I went to school in Bradford, and
awesome. All right.
So, lots of
I'd love to do that. That'd be awesome. Right. Thank you.
With my email address then.
Maybe we can take 5 more minutes for questions or quick comments if you wish to share any. I can ask a question. It may sound a bit naive, but please, Afzal, jump in, if you wish to share a response with us. I was just struck by the poetry and the music and and the beautiful vocalization, which reminded me of a lot of traditions actually. And that's another question. Maybe I'll save that for later. But I was intrigued by the idea of feeling at home through music and through poetry, and the movement that it facilitates, and how perhaps remembering that kind of poetry and music, or practicing it on a daily basis with people, creating these affinities, also feed into a sense of mobility, not simply perhaps a sense of rootedness or home or feeling at home, but a sense of mobility and a different understanding of the present, of the current environment, because that also brings back the idea of sonic and visual evocation through music, right? That was also fascinating to look at how melodies, how Hindustani classical music tradition evokes the landscape spatially and visually, and how that also creates a connection, a sense of movement, but also a sense of feeling at home. I just wondered whether you, Tom, you had a chance to talk about that with your, in your field work with people who wanted to reflect on this.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good observation. I think, this idea of movement is really central, right? And what I was trying to do in the paper a little bit by situating it in relation to the 19th century is that, part of this poetry, and part of poetry in general, is this kind of ambiguity lends itself to being understood in different contexts and different times in relation to your experiences of them. So this poetry is written, in and out of colonial rule. So these lessons about staying true to yourself, not eating fruit in foreign gardens and stuff, can we read that in terms of it being about, colonial rule in India and Pakistan, well, in India at the time, and then think about, well, how those lessons are understood in the context of places like Bradford. And to sort of then come to your question, I did some more recent research in Qatar, in Doha, among Mirpuris and Kashmiris who are working there now, building these kind of mega sporting stadiums. And, I was hanging out with taxi drivers who are spending their whole days sort of driving Qatari businessmen around. And they are just constantly texting home, family is still living back in Kashmir, and sending little clips of the Saif ul-Malook being sung or little quotes, and talking about it very much in terms of movements and journeys. So, I mean, they're taxi drivers, right? They're literally moving, all day, every day. And the poetry is providing its own path, and they talk about it. This is about a path in life, about a path back to Kashmir, about my connection there. So there is that sense of movement happening all the time, both in quite literal ways and through the imagery of the poetry itself. And I think, that's why I see it as being, quite an interesting way to think about migration, because it is something that is happening still very much in this community, to different parts of the world today. Thanks, Zainab.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, well, on that note then, I would like to thank you, Tom, first, and thank everyone who joined us today. It was a fascinating talk, a really beautiful talk, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to share this later because we recorded this video. So that's it from us, I guess, for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay well and safe, and hope to see you in another seminar. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Zainab, and thanks, everyone.